A few weeks ago, I published a video on Dior Homme Parfum 2025. Well, it's actually 2024 because it came out in December, but who's counting? In that video, I was addressing mainly the visceral outrage against the newcomer to bear the Dior Homme Parfum name, and simply stating the changing nature of who the Dior Homme Parfum actually was and who he is now. I didn't review Dior Homme Parfum 2025 in that video, which you should totally watch after you subscribe because it's awesome, because I think it's unfair to review a fragrance other than giving a first impression upon opening the bottle. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since then, and now I'm ready to review it. In that time, I've wore it on several occasions. Now, I live in Melbourne, Australia, g'day, and we are currently in summer. But fortunately, or unfortunately, whatever you want to call it, we have no climate here. I say fortunately because just last week it was cold and raining, whilst yesterday it was 40 degrees and today it's cold again. I took advantage of those wild weather fluctuations and wore Dior Homme Parfum in a variety of settings, in a variety of situations, from the office to the gym, from comfortable situations where I'm kicking back in my living room watching YouTube videos, to uncomfortable situations like in the back of a Volkswagen Beetle. I'll give you my thoughts on this parfum on its own, then I'll compare it to the original, Dior Homme Parfum, and then I'll mention the price and the perfumer discussions, and finally, the outrage. Dior Homme Parfum 2025 is a nice fragrance. It's a youthful fragrance. It's a familiar fragrance with, for me at least, above average performance, but sitting closer to the skin like a parfum generally does. In and of itself, it's a perfectly good option for a young man or woman for many occasions. Unfortunately, it's not in and of itself, not only because it smells so similar to so many other fragrances in the market that have been released before it, but namely because it's called Dior Homme Parfum, the same name as the original which existed before it. It reminds me of a story, because everything reminds me of a story, because I'm that old. But back in 1993, whilst on a basketball tournament in Los Angeles, our team was waiting for the coach in the hotel lobby. And we heard over the PA the hotel staff announcing, "Paging Mr. Michael Jordan. Can Mr. Michael Jordan please make your way to the hotel lobby? Thank you." Needless to say, the excitement in that hotel lobby was suddenly palpable. Everyone was waiting with bated breath to see the GOAT himself, even though everyone knew that there was very little hope that it was actually the real MJ. But that little glimmer of hope still remained. And then, like something out of a movie plot, in plods in this short white guy and goes, "Hi, I'm Michael Jordan. You were paging me." You could hear everyone in that lobby sigh in unison. Now, it wasn't that guy's fault. It was just our expectations getting the better of us. And frankly, we should have known better. I mean, just as if the GOAT is going to be staying at some two-bit hotel in downtown LA. So yeah, we were waiting on something that we knew was going to be worse than what came before it, but held on to a glimmer of hope that it wouldn't be. When it actually ended up not being up to our expectations, it was disappointing to say the least. Because in comparison to the original Dior Homme Parfum, this new one really can't compare. Where there was originality, there is now conformity. Where there was daring, there is now risk aversion. Where there was maturity, there is now immaturity. I was purposely wrong earlier to call it youthful. It's not youthfulness, because youthfulness has a vigor which Dior Homme Parfum 2025 lacks. And in some weird way, it still captures perfectly the youth of today. More immature than the last lot, striving to conform whilst idolizing the nonconformist. Lost, risk-averse, shallow, and distracted. Oh, and with the disposable income to be all of these things. How? What I only recently discovered is that the United States is paying almost $100 more for Dior Homme Parfum 2025 than we are here in Australia. Here in the land of Oz, a 75 ml of this direct from Dior would cost 217 Australian dollars, which is 135 US dollars as of today's rates. I saw that Dior in America is charging $180 for a 75 ml. And if you add sales tax of $18 in some places, that's $198, which is 320 Australian dollars. And let me tell you, if that was the price for it here, I wouldn't have bought it. Like even in Europe, it's 250 Australian dollars, which is still over $30 more than what I paid for it here. Again, I wouldn't have bought it. Now let's address the frustrations being thrown at the perfumer Francis Kurkdjian. Well, you could say he could have done better. You could say that. But think about that for a second. This kind of fragrance profile is his domain. It's as if the brief for the new Dior Homme Parfum from Dior, it's as if Dior came down and said, "Hey, Francis, can you please make a more upscale Lamal for those poor kids who like to act like ballers and then they go to the club to flex?" And he, of course, had to agree. And in that situation, so would I. And so would you. The frustrations are wrongly placed. And they're as wrongly placed as the lamentations and the heartfelt eulogies for Francois Demachy, the outgoing perfumer at Dior. Why, oh why? Why, oh why did Demachy have to leave? He was a genius, what a legacy. Everyone seems to conveniently forget that he simply built on the foundations of the original Dior Homme, which was the work of Olivier Polge. I'm not giving Demachy full credit for copying and tweaking someone else's homework. Yes, he did a good job with Dior Homme Intense. He did a very good job with the original Dior Homme Parfum. But none of that would have even existed without Polge laying the solid base from which to build on. And people seem to forget that Demachy is responsible for the abomination that is Dior's Sauvage. Yes, the one that's in every normie's wardrobe, the one that is the butt of many jokes in Fragcom. I've seen countless jabs at Dior and even Johnny Depp for Sauvage, but I've never seen Demachy cop any flack for it. Now, before you come at me, I'm not saying Demachy is a bad perfumer. On the contrary, it takes immense talent to build on the vision of another person. I'm just pointing out the double standard here. And speaking of coming at me, let's address the outrage and how this release is a pretty monumental shift away from anything we can consider as done in good faith. But before we do, that's my review. It's done. For all the normies, you can switch off now. But in true me fashion, I thought way too much about this and went down a philosophical rabbit hole. And if you give me 2 minutes of your time, I'll open your mind to a perspective that you probably hadn't thought of before. Ready? The outrage stems from a lack of religion. Plain and simple. Now, I have to preface this by saying I'm not religious at all. But the outrage and the visceral reactions against this fragrance stem from a lack of religion. Weird? Tell me more. Religion, at the heart of it, is the belief that you're connected to something bigger than yourself. I mean, not literally, because that would be silly. Like, imagine chaining yourself to a cruise ship. Shut up. But metaphorically, being connected to or being part of something bigger than you is something you can derive meaning from. And if you live in that way, your belief is that you're leading a meaningful life. That's actually praise, as in your life has meaning. There's something good to it. But the modern psychological model of meaning has become strangely divorced from the cultivation of virtue and wisdom. If you look across all the religions and the philosophical traditions, you'll find the cultivation of meaning, virtue, and wisdom are woven tightly together. You like this hand gesture? It's good. And yet today, when people talk about meaning of life, they only talk about the individual attitudes. They'll tell you they have friends, they have family, they have work projects, so their life is pretty meaningful. But if you ask them, does the world make sense to you? Do you trust it? Does it present itself to you with a lot of beauty and depth? Most people will say, huh? And then they'll think about it and they'll say, no, not really. And if you follow that up with, is your meaning in life bringing you a lot of peace? Does it help you grow as a person? Does it open you to reality? And the answer is still often no. And that might be because people are experiencing a lot of burnout, a lot of bullshit, and a lot of betrayal. They're losing trust and faithfulness in their institutions and their fellow people. There's a famine of faithfulness and fellowship. Try saying that 10 times fast. There's a famine of faithfulness and fellowship, which is a lack of trust in each other and in the world. And when trust is broken, meaning crumbles. A sense of betrayal can undermine anything that once brought purpose. And this is reflected in the rampant rise of cynicism and nihilism in popular media. And because of massive doses of burnout, betrayal, and bullshit, people have just sort of given up on the world. And the problem is, our model of ourselves is bound up with our model of the world. If we see the world as a frightening, unreliable place, we withdraw into ourselves more and more and more, becoming insular and defensive. And that's the behavior of an organism in pain, in distress, and in depression. This paradox plays out in our lives. We've grown more affluent, more connected through technology, and yet loneliness and despair and depression are at all-time highs. Social connections increase, but friendships decrease. We're doing more and more, but it's giving us less and less. And so there's this replacement strategy, substituting traditional sources of meaning, connection, and community like religion or philosophy, with alternative obsessions or passions, like fragrances, for example, to fill a void left by their absence. People are trying to replace that with things like the fragrant universe, which they invest in, they identify with, they go to their review boards, they post their thoughts, they make videos, they comment on videos, comment on my video please. They make forum posts, they create altars and thrones to the tangible symbols of fragrance, and they protect their universe with a religious fervor. And this has led us to a rage, a self-righteous rage over Dior Homme Parfum 2025. The reformulation feels like sacrilege. Add to that the general rage over how fragrance houses, IFRA, corporate greed, perfumers, and the scourge of the influencer have collectively destroyed the universe that was once pristine and hallowed. And I agree with the surface-level criticism. I do think restrictions and corporate risk aversion has ruined a lot of fragrances by unallowing the ones of the past, reformulating the ones currently in production, and never even giving a chance to the ones that could have been created if these rotten pillars of the current system didn't exist. But, the thing people don't spend enough time on is, why does this matter so much? Why do you spend hours raging about this? That's the replacement strategy. What the outrage against Dior Homme Parfum 2025 showed is that no one has a monopoly on foolishness. It also showed who of us lacks existential resilience, because as soon as the thing that was their normal routine looked like it was going to be disrupted, they were confronted with an abyss of meaninglessness, and they dove headfirst into a pit of rage. These reactions were egocentric and self-centered. How does this affect me? That's all I heard. That's all I read. This egocentrism can masquerade as spirituality, the self-centered spirituality, what you might call the religion of me, is the part of the problem. This is part of the problem because it mimics religious behavior, but only serves the self because it's evaluated by the self for the benefit of the self. And that's extremely problematic. Because whilst we're generally very, very good at pointing out the biases in our friends and other people, we're really, really bad at doing it for ourselves. History has shown us success when we address these biases together, because you are my best source of self-correction and I am yours. So the more we become withdrawn and self-centered, the more we're going to fall prey to self-deceptive behavior, and the more we might not pay proper attention to the deep interconnections between our spirituality and our responsibilities. But what if we reframed this question? Instead of asking, what's in it for me? We should ask, how much meaning am I creating for others? How much beauty am I bringing into this world? This is not easy to do, especially if we're in a pattern of withdrawal. And even more so when you consider that the problems of meaning increase as the nation you're in becomes more affluent. And those of us in these environments, in these nations, have no doubt felt that we have to put more and more effort in just simply not to fall behind or miss out. And we wonder why we have an epidemic of burnout and busy unto death. As a result, I think we've lost fellowship. Fellowship isn't simply friendship. I mean, think of the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. It was getting together with people that we basically trust because we all participate in something that we are committed to together and is something greater than ourselves. It's what we used to find in the church or the mosque or the temple or the synagogue. We've lost all of those things. And faithfulness. Sticking with things even when it's hard. That's become rare. Relationships and communities, once built to last, now feel temporary and transactional. The real-world effect of this is that people are finding it harder and harder to maintain long-term relationships. Here's a tidbit. Here's a factoid, right? The level of secularism within a nation is predicted by the degree to which people are living individually alone, whereas more religious communities tend to be related to people who live in more extended family situations. And as you grow up, you have to learn to trust yourself to credible others, because you can't simply believe you know everything. So you have to trust that these credible others can see things that you can't see, and what seems like senseless behavior to you actually has a deeper meaning and function to it. Now, throughout history, we've relied on the family to give us those entrusted relationships, but over time, we've narrowed the family down to the nomadic nuclear family, and that has seriously eradicated a lot of ways in which we could get meaning in life. And that's why this outrage over Dior Homme Parfum matters. I think it matters. It's not just about the fragrance. It's about the bigger picture. It's about how we've lost our sense of connection, faithfulness, and shared meaning. That leaves us having to reframe the question of, how is everything relevant to me? To, how am I relevant to somebody other than myself?